Yo, welcome back to the channel, boys and girls. In today's video, as you can see, I'm very excited. Today's video, we are taking a look at my brand new Giant Propel Advanced Pro bike because the bike build is finished. So of course, we're going to go over all the details from the front to the back. And then of course, we're going to take this out on the road and I'm going to give you my initial thoughts on this bike because I've now ridden this bike about 300 miles or so. But spoiler alert, this is by far the best bike I've ever ridden. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so as you guys know, I purchased a Giant Propel Advanced Pro model. I'll actually link somewhere up on the bottom or the top of the screen my previous video where I did an unboxing and first look on this frame. But the frame set that you see here, as I mentioned in that video, is $300 USD. And now that is not the top tier version of the Giant Propel frame. It does not have the integrated seat mast. This is the second tier version of the frame set. But anyway, starting with the front of the bike, let's go over some of the components. So the first thing you'll see here is we have this lovely looking Prime bike components carbon Aero handlebars. Now the width up top is 38 centimeters as well as on the drops. I really love the ergonomics of this handlebar. The retail on this is, I want to say it's like $200 USD. The reach on it is basically average. It's like 75 centimeters, but I love the ergonomics of this handlebars. It's really light for what it is. And in the center where the stem would clamp, there is a exit port to enable to route the cables into the stem. Now moving on to the stem, as you guys can see, this is quite a long stem because I do have pretty long arms for my height. But this is from Giant. It's very expensive. It's like $400, which is insane for a carbon stem. But the specs on this stem, it's 140 millimeters long with a -10 drop. The interesting thing about this stem is one, that it is pretty light for what it is. I did the weights in the previous video on this frame set, but what's cool about it is rather than routing the cables through the stem itself, there actually is a little cutout beneath the stem that allows you to route the cables underneath the stem. That way, if you do want to swap out the length of the stem itself, you don't have to go rerouting and unplugging your hydraulic cables. You can still keep everything nice and neat. And then of course we have Supacaz Bartape, just in an all black finish. This is my favorite brand of Bartape. Works really well. It grips when the roads get wet, and they just work as intended. Okay, moving to the center of the frame. I should mention that the size of this frame is a medium large. The geometry on this specific size works really well for my reach and for my height. So yeah, kudos to Giant on that respects. So looking at the bottle cages, these bottle cages are actually included with the price of the Giant Propel. They're supposed to be aerodynamics. They're really light for what they are. I've already done measurements in my previous video on the unboxing of this frame set, but it keeps the bottles really snug and they work very well, just as you would expect. Moving on to the drivetrain. So let's talk about the drivetrain for a second. So I am, of course, as you can see, I'm running a Shimano Di2 12 speed. Out front, we have a 5236, mid compact crank. Out back, we have a 11 to 30 12 speed cassette, which works really well. And then as far as the power meter that I'm using a SRAM/Quarq power meter. I've liked this power meter a lot. I have the same exact setup on my Windspace T1500 frame set, and the power, the data, the metrics on it is very accurate. In fact, all of my power meters are by SRAM/Quarq. Now the thing with running this Quarq D4 power meter is you have to run a SRAM/Dub bottom bracket. And so for my bottom bracket with this frame set, I am running a Kogel bearings, ceramic bearings. That bottom bracket cost me like $250, which is pretty expensive for a bottom bracket, but this is going to be my long-term bike. So I wanted to go with a bottom bracket that I've been using on some of my other frames, and it works really well. As far as the length of the carbon cranks, I'm running a 172.5 length cranks. For reference, I'm like 6 feet tall, 183 centimeters, something like that. As far as the pedals goes, I'm using these Look Keo Blade carbon blades, and then the bearings inside of here are ceramic. Okay, moving to the rear of the bike, let's first talk about this saddle. Now, this saddle is also from Giant that I had to pay separately on. I got it on sale for like $170. As far as the length goes, it's not quite a super short nose saddle, but it's also not a traditional length saddle. It's somewhere in between. The rails are carbon or carbon composite, as is the cage or the shell of the saddle as well. And I really like the saddle a lot. It's very, very comfortable. I would say for my sit bone style and my shape and all that, it is marginally more comfortable than my Specialized or S-Works power saddles. I really, really like it. And for $170 for a saddle that's cost me under $200, and it also weighs under 200 grams, it's a pretty good deal. Now, one thing I do want to note really quickly is if you look at the seat post style, it is on the thinner side, and I've noticed that it does offer a little bit of extra compliance. It doesn't mean that it's flexy or anything like that, but it does allow for some comfort versus like a super chunky seat post style that you would expect with something like a S-Works Venge. Moving on to the tires. Now, these are some of my favorite tires that I have, or excuse me, I'm sorry, wheels. These wheels are my Magene EXAR DB Pro 508 Ultra wheels. They're like the second lightest set of wheels I've ever tested on this channel. They're like 1,360 grams, 58 millimeters in the rear, 50 millimeters deep in the front. And I just like the way that these wheels look as far as the overall aesthetics for this bike, because this bike is supposed to be like a one bike to rule them all versus some all-out Aero frame set on the flats. I've been just liking the way that these wheels really complement this frame as a whole. Now, as far as tires, I am running my trusty GP 5000s in the 28C version. I'm running about like 77 PSI in the rear, 75 in the front. That's my setup for sort of faster rides or fast group rides. And then if I'm just puttering around town or doing a recovery ride, I probably will drop the PSI down to about 75 in the rear and then maybe like 72, 73 in the front. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we take this bike out on the road is weight. Now, when I originally had this bike built up, I had my Windspace or Loon D67 super deep Aero wheels paired with this frame. And the weight on that, without power meter, bottle cages, all this stuff, it came into about 7.6 kilograms. And then with everything added back on, pedals, power meter, garment mount, etc., it came into about 7.9 kilograms all in, which is pretty decent, all things considered, for the price point. And that was with latex inner tubes. But since then, since I've switched out the wheels and also switched to TPU inner tubes, which effectively saves about 300 grams because these wheels are about 200 grams lighter than those Windspace Hyper wheels. And then, of course, you save about another 100 grams going from latex inner tubes to TPU inner tubes. So now the weight of this bike is closer to about 7.3 kilograms without pedals, power meters, cages, etc. And then all in with everything you see right here, you're looking at about 7.6 kilograms. So 7.6 kilograms all in for a bike with the frame set costing about $3,000. I would say that is pretty respectable, all things considered. But now let's go ahead and take this bike out on the road so I can give you some of my on-the-road thoughts about this bike now that I've ridden it for about 300 miles. Alrighty, we are riding the Giant Propel Advance Pro. One of the first things that I immediately noticed on this frame set, like I'm talking about the first 30 seconds on getting on this frame right after I built it, is the back end. Just the way the back end of this frame set responds to bad pavement, when you're out of the saddle, when you're at speed, when you're descending. You can tell that a lot of the engineering on this frame set, and this is what you're paying for, a lot of that money in engineering is being spent on the rear triangle. Especially coming from a cheap Chinese frame set, this is the one area of the bike that you can immediately tell the comfort and the refinement that this Giant Propel has to offer. Rather than simply having some sort of mold for a frame set and just slapping a whole bunch of carbon fiber together, you can tell that Giant, they really put a lot of consideration to the carbon layup. I mean, obviously I can't inspect the frame set layer by layer, but you can tell that there actually has been a lot of attention to detail with setting up the carbon on this frame set. And I think, you know, like I mentioned before, with how the money is being used to set up the frame and the design, this is one of the things that the Chinese frame sets, they simply just can't do based on the price that they're offering for these frame sets. Now again, this first initial thoughts on this bike. This is not intended to be compared to a cheap Chinese bike, but I'm going to disappoint all of you cheap Chinese bike frames lovers out there, including myself. This bike is miles ahead of that bike. Now, is this bike 5 times the price of those? Of course not, but what I can say is the sum of all parts, we're talking about all the small details added up together, this is what really proves that going with the big name bike brand, this is what you're paying for. You're paying for the control, the comfort of a rough pavement, and just really how this bike responds out of the saddle as well as when you're at speed. Now, quite literally, this bike felt so good on the first initial ride that I immediately took the bike the very next day and went out on a 90-mile, basically a 100-mile ride, because I could just tell, okay, this bike is very special. Now, another aspect of this bike is just how this bike feels and responds when you're simply just puttering around a town in the roads. Basically what I'm doing right now is this bike does not punish you at the slower speeds. And again, this is something that the cheaper bikes that they seem to have an issue with, where you're basically always reminded that you're riding a cheap bike. And just the way this bike feels overall, the sensation, this bike has nothing like that. I suppose the best way I can describe this sort of sensation of this ride is comparing, say, like a Japanese tuned Fast and Furious sort of car versus riding something like a modern day, maybe not a Porsche because this bike is not that luxurious, but maybe just a modern day sports car in general. Both the old school Japanese tuner car and the modern day sports car, you could make them just as equally fast. You could probably even make them handle just as well for both of them. However, just the overall feeling and sensation and just the refinement, this is the bike that you definitely can understand. There's a lot more refinement here. Even there's more refinement on this frame than even with my Windspace. And again, I absolutely love my Windspace T1500 frame set, but even that bike at times, especially when you're really putting down the power and you're really at speed, even that bike as well suffers from a little bit of uncontrollable sort of swaying in the back end of the bike. And what I mean is, I don't want to use the word compliant, but this bike on the back end has a lot more control than even my Windspace T1500. Now, who do I think this frame set and just bike overall is for? I think this bike is for that one sort of rider who's looking for one bike to rule them all, similar to the Specialized Tarmac SO7. This is a bike that, honestly, this is gonna be all you need. You don't need an aero bike, you don't need a climbing bike. I can imagine that this bike climbs very well because the bottom bracket area is stiff. This is a bike, this is the only one bike that you would need, the frame set, and you'll be able to enjoy it for years and years. Now, a question that you might be wondering is this bike actually faster than, say, my Specialized LA Sprint, my Windspace T1500, or even some of my other cheap Chinese Aero frames? Now, using the same sort of setup, same wheels, tires, latex inner tubes, I actually have been doing some testing in the last couple of weeks because I knew that this was going to be a question that you would have. And basically, the testing I did was a 50-mile loop. It's probably, I don't know, maybe 60 miles, excuse me. And the watt output is somewhere between like 175 to 190. And based on that effort in a 50-minute loop, I've determined that this bike is actually marginally faster than those frame sets. So you're not just getting a bike that is lighter than all of those and it costs all this extra money versus those, but you are in fact getting a bike that has been engineered, has been wind tunnel tested to actually be fast. And based on my research, now again, this isn't some sort of super scientific approach to it. It's just basically going off a feeling and simply just timing my efforts based on the watt output. And I have determined that this bike is in fact faster than those bikes. Yeesh, that is a gorgeous looking bike. Would I say this is the best looking bike that I've ever tested? That I'm not too sure about just yet. The verdict is still out, but I just love the way this bike looks. It's quite understated. Then of course we have the tan wall tires, which sort of just gives it that pop. Then of course my super long BBC 140 -10 carbon stem, and then the cables run right underneath the stem to keep everything clean, but still makes it very easy to swap out the stem should you want to do that without having to reroute all of the cables. But I'm so happy with how this bike turned out as a whole as far as the bike build goes. You know, one of the things that I think really goes unnoticed when it comes to riding your bikes, especially when you're dealing with cheaper frame sets on the market, is when you're purchasing these cheap frames, you always know in the back of your head that you're going to be making some sort of compromise. You may have a frame that's going to be stiff, but then it might just beat you up on the road every single day, whether you're going fast or slow. Or you may have a cheap bike that might be very comfortable, but then it basically feels like a noodle. It doesn't feel fast. It doesn't give you any sort of sensation of speed when you're putting down the power. And a thing that when it comes to these bigger bike brands, and again, you know, it could be just sort of an anecdotal experience, but there is sort of an emotional attachment that you do get when you are riding a frame set or just a bike as a whole, where you know that all the bits and pieces you built yourself, you are buying into sort of a ethos or ecosystems with a big brand that you know that they've put a lot of effort and time in designing the frame. And so every time that I've ridden this bike so far, at this point, I've ridden this bike about 300 miles. Every time I hop on this bike, it does sort of invoke or provoke some sort of feeling. And I really haven't had that sort of feeling of excitement and speed ever since I would say probably my Windspace T1500 frame set. And that's a very difficult thing to do, especially for a bike. You expect to get these sort of feelings of you know, excitement and speed, maybe when you're purchasing a car or something to that effect. But for a bike to do that, for me, I think really highlights just how special this bike is. And I just love everything about this. This is exactly the bike I wanted. Yes, I could have gone with the SLR version of this frame set. It would have been a little bit lighter, but I didn't want to deal with the integrated seat mass. None of that stuff. This carbon saddle is very comfortable. I'm shocked of how quickly I was able to set up this bike very, very comfortably. No saddle sores, no blowing out the knees, nothing like that. I've had this bike set up perfectly. I love everything about it, and even just the subtle glitter. You probably can't see it right now, but in the sunlight there's a subtle glitter to the paint job as well. And yeah, this is just a bike that really just invokes a lot of emotions to me. I'm super happy with the build. A common question that I've been receiving over these past 3 years is, why do I keep reviewing cheap, affordable Chinese frames? When am I going to test out a more expensive premium frame, and what's taking me so long? And obviously, number one, the answer to that is money, because purchasing a frame at this level obviously is expensive, as opposed to having, you know, one of the cheaper Chinese brands send me out a frame for free to test out. So that's the main reason. Another reason why too it's taking me so long to finally get my hands on a premium frame is because, quite frankly, I didn't think that I needed, you know, to have such a premium frame. And the third reason why is I really wanted to do my due diligence on reviewing all of the cheaper frames from the $500 to the $1,500 price point, so that by the time I got to a bike such as this giant Propel, I could really speak freely on understanding all of the different nuances, the pros and cons, the road sensation, the stiffness, the road sort of feeling, compliance, all of that. And with all of this being said, are there significantly tangible differences? Absolutely, absolutely. So you're not just paying for marketing, a bunch of snake oil. You are truly, in fact, receiving or purchasing a premium frame set. So that is going to wrap up today's video, guys. Of course, there will be a longer term review on this bike. Hopefully I can get that out to you guys before it gets too cold here in Chicago, because we are in October and it's going to be getting cold here very, very soon. But as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them down below, and I'm gonna check you guys on the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and once again, thank you for all of your support over these years, and I'm gonna check you guys on the next one. Peace.